Do you ever get a gut feeling and then immediately dismiss it? That discomfort, that fear of your own inner knowing is holding you back in ways you can't imagine. Spiritually aware individuals have learned to trust this internal compass, uncover the shocking reasons why most people fear their own profound intuition, and how embracing it can change everything. You know, it's quite fascinating, really. We walk around with this extraordinary instrument inside us. Call it intuition, call it inner knowing, call it the still small voice, and yet we treat it as though it were an unreliable stranger. Imagine having a compass and constantly doubting whether it points north. You'd be perpetually lost, wouldn't you? And yet, that's precisely what most of us do with our inner guidance. Now, the spiritually awake person, and let me be clear, I don't mean someone in flowing robes who's renounced the world. I mean someone who's simply woken up from the cultural hypnosis we're all under. This person has discovered something remarkable. They've discovered that the intuition isn't some mystical nonsense. It's actually the most intelligent thing about them. It's the part that isn't cluttered with other people's opinions, society's conditioning, and the accumulated debris of secondhand thinking. But here's where it gets interesting. Why do we dismiss it? Why do we feel that uncomfortable knot in our stomach when our gut says, don't do this, and yet we do it anyway? Why do we override that quiet certainty when every cell in our body is trying to tell us something? The answer, my friends, is that we've been taught to magnificently, systematically taught to doubt ourselves. Let me tell you something that nobody really wants to hear. From the moment you could understand language, you've been programmed. Not in some sinister conspiracy theory way, but in a very ordinary, well-meaning way. Your parents, your teachers, your culture, they all taught you that real wisdom comes from outside, not inside. Think about it. When you were a child and you said, I don't want to hug Uncle Bob, what happened? You were told, don't be rude. Go give him a hug. Your feeling that inexplicable discomfort was overridden by social convention. When you said, I don't like this food, you were told you haven't even tried it. Clean your plate. Your body's wisdom was subordinated to someone else's idea of what you should consume. Layer by layer, year by year, you learned a very dangerous lesson. Don't trust yourself. Trust the authority. Trust the expert. Trust anyone but that quiet voice inside. Now, here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Our entire civilization is built on this principle. We have experts for everything. We have someone to tell us how to eat, how to exercise, how to raise our children, how to think, how to feel, how to be. And I'm not saying expertise is worthless. Of course, it's valuable. But somewhere along the way, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. We became so dependent on external validation that we forgot we have our own inner authority. Let me give you a real example. A man I once knew, let's call him Richard, was offered a prestigious position at a law firm. Every external marker said this was the right move. More money, more status, more security. His family was thrilled. His colleagues were envious. But Richard had this persistent feeling in his chest, like something was sitting on his rib cage. Every time he thought about taking the job, he felt heavier, but he couldn't articulate why. There was no logical reason to refuse, so he took it. And for the next 5 years, he was successful and miserable. He did everything right and felt everything wrong. His marriage suffered. His health declined. He developed insomnia and a drinking problem, all because he overrode that initial knowing that said, this isn't your path, or consider relationships. How many people do you know who stayed in partnerships that were slowly suffocating them? They couldn't point to any obvious problem. He wasn't abusive. She was financially stable. They had history. Everyone thought they were perfect together, but that inner knowing kept whispering, this isn't it. This isn't your person. And they silenced it. They rationalized. They made lists of pros and cons as if love could be calculated like a tax return. The immediate consequence of suppressing this inner knowing is not subtle. It manifests as anxiety, that constant background hum of unease that something isn't quite right. It shows up as regret, that haunting feeling that you've betrayed yourself. And perhaps most devastatingly, it creates a sense of being adrift, of living someone else's life, of being a stranger to yourself. You see, when you consistently ignore your intuition, you're essentially telling your deepest self, I don't trust you. I don't value you. Everyone else knows better than you do. And after years of this, you become disconnected from your own center. You become a ship without a rudder, blown about by every opinion, every trend, every autumn should. The tragedy is that society celebrates this disconnection. We call it being rational, being sensible, being mature. We're taught that feelings are unreliable and that only logic and external evidence should guide us. But here's what nobody tells you. That so-called logic is often just rationalization. It's the mind creating elaborate justifications for choices that have already been made based on fear, conditioning, and other people's expectations. The spiritually awake person sees through this game. They've recognized that the fear of trusting their intuition isn't really about the intuition being unreliable. It's about the consequences of following it, because when you truly trust your inner knowing, you might have to make choices that disappoint people. You might have to walk away from situations that look good on paper. You might have to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. And that's terrifying because we're social creatures and we're hardwired for approval. The thought of disappointing others, of being seen as weird or irresponsible or foolish, that's more frightening than betraying ourselves. So we make the comfortable choice, the socially acceptable choice, and we wonder why we feel so empty. Now let's talk about what this spiritual awakening business really means. Because there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about it. People imagine it's about levitating or seeing auras or having mystical experiences on mountaintops, but that's not it at all. Spiritual awakening is simply waking up from the trance of conditioned thinking. It's like this. Imagine you've been wearing sunglasses your entire life. Sunglasses that were put on you as a child. These glasses have a particular tint, a particular filter. They make some things visible and other things invisible. They make some things seem important and other things seem trivial, and you've worn them so long that you've forgotten you're wearing them. You think the way you see the world is the way the world actually is. Awakening is taking off those glasses. Suddenly you see that the filtering was happening all along. You see that what you thought was reality plus interpretation, reality plus conditioning, reality plus a whole collection of beliefs you never consciously chose. And here's where it gets really interesting. The spiritually awake person has discovered something profound about that inner knowing we've been discussing for them. It's not a whisper. It's not some faint signal they have to strain to hear. It's actually the clearest, most trustworthy thing they have access to. It's become their primary source of guidance. Why? Because they've realized something fundamental. External sources of wisdom, books, teachers, experts, traditions. These are all filtered through other people's experiences, other people's conditioning, other people's agendas. Even the most well-meaning advice comes with bias. But your inner knowing, when you learn to access it clearly, is direct. It's unfiltered. It's yours. Now, I must be careful here because people misunderstand this. They think I'm saying just do whatever you feel like doing. That's not it at all. The inner knowing I'm talking about isn't the same as your preferences or your emotional reactions or your fears and desires. Those are all part of the conditioned self, the ego. The true inner knowing comes from a deeper place. It's more like a resonance, a sense of rightness or wrongness that exists beyond thought. You can't force it or manipulate it. You can only learn to listen to it. The awake person has learned to distinguish between the voice of conditioning, which is loud, insistent, often fear-based, and the voice of inner knowing, which is quiet, steady, and certain. One says, you should do this because the other simply knows without needing reasons. Here's something that might surprise you. The spiritually awake person has completely reversed the usual hierarchy of validation, where most people look outward for confirmation, seeking approval, asking advice, checking what's normal. The awake person looks inward first. External perspectives become interesting data points, not commandments. This is what I mean by the illusion of external validation. We've all been trained to believe that truth resides in authorities, in traditions, in consensus, in credentials, and certainly these things have value, but the awake person has discovered that the ultimate authority for their life is inside them. Nobody else is living their life. Nobody else has their unique combination of temperament, history, purpose, and path. so nobody else can tell them what's truly right for them. This doesn't make them arrogant or dismissive of others. Paradoxically, it often makes them more humble because they're not trying to impose their truth on anyone else. They've realized that each person has their own inner compass, their own path to walk. What's true for one may not be true for another. But here's where most people get stuck. They confuse self-rust with certainty. They think, well, I don't know what to do, so clearly I can't trust my intuition. But the awake person understands that the inner knowing doesn't always provide a clear roadmap. Sometimes it just says move in this direction or not this or wait. And they've learned to trust even these subtle signals. They've also learned something crucial about the mind, the thinking mind, that chattering voice that's constantly analyzing, judging, comparing, planning. That's not where the inner knowing lives. That's where anxiety lives. That's where confusion lives. The inner knowing exists in a quieter space, beneath or beyond the thinking. You know how sometimes you just know something, but you can't explain how you know it? That's what I'm talking about. The awake person has learned to trust that knowing, even when they can't justify it logically. They've had enough experiences of their intuition being right, even when it seemed wrong, that they've built a trust relationship with it. This represents a fundamental shift in how reality is perceived. Most people experience themselves as separate individuals in a potentially hostile universe, trying to figure out what to do based on limited information and constant fear of making mistakes. The awake person experiences themselves as part of an intelligent universe that's trying to guide them. And their intuition is how that guidance communicates. It's not that they think some supernatural being is telling them what to do. It's more that they've recognized that the same intelligence that grows their hair and beats their heart and digests their food, that intelligence also knows things their conscious mind doesn't. And they've learned to trust it. Now, here's where it gets practical and really quite beautiful. The spiritually awake person has completely reframed what we call failure. You see, most people are paralyzed by the fear of making wrong decisions. They agonize over choices. They second guess themselves. They live in constant anxiety about whether they're on the right path. But the awake person, they understand that there are no wrong paths. There's only feedback. When something doesn't work out, when they make a choice that leads to difficulty or disappointment, they don't interpret it as personal failure. They see it as the universe saying, interesting, not quite in alignment. Let's adjust. Imagine learning to ride a bicycle. When you wobble and nearly fall, you don't say, I've failed at bicycling. I'll never ride again. You simply adjust your balance. You learn. You recalibrate. The spiritually awake person treats all of life this way. Every experience, pleasant or unpleasant, is information from their inner knowing, helping them navigate toward greater alignment with their authentic self. This is enormously liberating because when you're not afraid of making mistakes, you're free to experiment, to try, to follow those hunches and see where they lead. You might take a job that doesn't work out, but you learn something essential about what you actually value. You might enter a relationship that ends, but you discover aspects of yourself that could only emerge through that connection. Nothing is wasted. Everything is teaching you to trust yourself more deeply. Now, let me tell you about something I call cosmic synchronicity. This is one of the most delightful discoveries of the awakened path. When you start trusting your intuition and making choices from that deep inner knowing, the strangest thing happens. Life starts to flow. You think about someone and they call. You need information and a book falls off the shelf. You're wondering about a career change and suddenly opportunities appear. You feel drawn to take a different route home and you bump into exactly the person you needed to meet. Now, I'm not talking about magic. I'm talking about something far more interesting. When you're in alignment with your authentic self, when you're following your inner compass, you're naturally drawn to people, places, and situations that match that frequency, and they're drawn to you. It's like this. When you're living from fear and conditioning, you're sending out a very confused signal to the universe. You're saying yes when you mean no. You're pursuing things you don't actually want. You're trying to be someone you're not. And life responds to that confusion with more confusion. But when you start living from your inner knowing, everything clarifies. You're sending out a clear signal. You're taking actions that are genuinely aligned with who you are and what you're here to do. And suddenly the universe can work with you instead of against you. The awake person doesn't struggle and force and push. They allow and follow and flow. They've discovered that there's an intelligence to life that's far greater than their small planning mind. And when they align with that intelligence which speaks through their intuition, life becomes almost effortless. Not effortless in the sense that nothing requires work, but effortless in the sense that they're no longer fighting themselves. They're no longer trying to force square pegs into round holes. They're like water flowing downhill, finding the natural path, moving around obstacles, persistent but not rigid. This brings us to perhaps the most radical aspect of the awakened perspective, letting go of societal conditioning. And I mean really letting go, not just giving it lip service. Society gives you a script. Go to school, get good grades, get a good job, get married, buy a house, have children, retire, die. And within that script, there are endless subscripts. You should look a certain way, earn a certain amount, achieve certain milestones by certain ages. You should want certain things, value certain things, be certain things. And look, there's nothing wrong with any of those things if they're genuinely right for you. But the tragedy is how many people follow the script without ever asking, is this actually my script? Is this what I authentically want? Or is this just what I've been conditioned to want? The spiritually awake person has had the courage to ask that question. And often the answer is uncomfortable. They discover that maybe they don't want the big house or the impressive career. Maybe they don't want children or marriage or any of the conventional markers of success. Or maybe they do want those things, but for completely different reasons than society suggests. The point is, they've made their desires conscious. They've examined their conditioning instead of being run by it. And then they've made the radical choice to honor their authentic truth, even when it disappoints others or makes them look weird or means walking away from security. This is terrifying for most people because honoring your authentic truth means you might have to say, everyone expects me to take over the family business, but I want to paint. Or I know I'm supposed to settle down, but I need to travel. Or this relationship looks perfect from the outside, but it's killing me from the inside. The awake person has learned that the cost of betraying yourself is always higher than the cost of disappointing others. Always, because when you betray yourself, you lose yourself. And then what have you got? A life that looks good in photographs but feels empty when you're alone at 3 a.m. They've also discovered something wonderful. When you have the courage to follow your inner knowing, even when it's unconventional, you give others permission to do the same. You become living proof that there are other ways to be. And that's a profound gift to offer the world. Now you might be thinking, this all sounds lovely, but how do I actually do it? How do I access this inner knowing you keep talking about? And I'm glad you're asking, because this is where philosophy becomes practice. First, you have to learn to be still. And I don't mean some rigid meditation practice, although that can help. I mean, you have to create space in your life where you're not constantly distracted, constantly busy, constantly consuming information and entertainment. You see, your intuition is always speaking, but you can't hear it over the noise. It's like trying to hear someone whisper at a rock concert. So the first practice is simply this. Turn down the volume of your life. Spend time in silence. Spend time in nature. Spend time just being instead of doing. When you do this, something remarkable happens. All the thoughts and feelings and anxieties that you've been running from start to surface. This is uncomfortable. This is why most people stay busy, to avoid this discomfort. But if you can sit with it, if you can watch it without trying to fix it or change it or run from it, it begins to settle. And beneath all that noise, you start to hear something else. A quieter voice. A sense of knowing that doesn't come from thinking. This is your intuition. This is your inner compass. And it's been there all along waiting for you to listen. Here's a practice I recommend. When you're facing a decision, instead of making a list of pros and cons, although there's nothing wrong with that as one input, take a moment to get quiet. Close your eyes. Take a few deep breaths, then imagine yourself making choice A. Really imagine it. How does your body feel? Do you feel expansive or contracted? Light or heavy, open or closed? Then do the same with choice B. Again, notice what your body tells you, because here's something most people don't realize. Your body knows before your mind knows. Your body is responding to information that your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. That knot in your stomach, that's information. That feeling of lightness, that's information. That sense of expansion or contraction, all information. The awake person has learned to read these subtle cues. They've learned that the body doesn't lie. The mind can rationalize anything, but the body tells the truth. Another practice, start noticing your immediate reactions before your mind kicks in. When you meet someone, what's your first impression before you start judging whether you should have that impression? When you enter a space, how does it feel before you start analyzing whether it's decorated nicely? When someone makes a suggestion, what's your gut response before you start thinking about whether it's practical? That first hit, that immediate response, that's often your intuition. It's the unfiltered data before your conditioning processes it. Now here's where it gets interesting, what I call the undoing of self-doubt. You see, doubt isn't the opposite of faith or trust. Doubt is actually a form, of thinking. It's your mind spinning stories about why you can't trust yourself, why you don't know enough, why you might be wrong. The antidote to doubt isn't trying to create certainty, it's recognizing doubt for what it is. Just another thought, just another story. When you can see doubt arising without identifying with it, without believing it, it loses its power. Try this. When doubt arises, instead of arguing with it or trying to suppress it, simply acknowledge it. Ah, there's doubt. How interesting. Don't make it mean anything about you or your intuition. It's just a mental pattern probably learned in childhood, probably trying to protect you in some outdated way. And then beneath that doubt, notice if there's a knowing, not a thinking or a hoping or a wishing, a knowing, even a small one, and trust that knowing more than the doubt. This takes practice. You're essentially retraining your relationship with yourself. For years, you've given the voice of doubt more weight than the voice of knowing. You're learning to reverse that. Here's a daily practice that can help. Each morning, before you get caught up in the day's demands, sit quietly and ask yourself, what does my deepest self want me to know today? Then listen. Don't force an answer. Don't make something up. Just listen and notice what arises. It might be a word, it might be an image, it might be a feeling, it might be nothing at all. That's okay. You're building a relationship, opening a channel of communication. Trust takes time. Also, start honoring your intuition in small ways. If you feel drawn to take a different route to work, take it. If you have an impulse to call someone, call them. If something tells you not to attend an event, skip it. These small acts of trust build confidence in your inner knowing. And pay attention to what happens. You'll start to notice that your intuition is actually quite reliable. You took the different route and avoided traffic. You called that person and they needed to hear from you. You skipped the event and preserved your energy for something more important. Each time you honor your intuition and it serves you well, you're reinforcing that trust. You're proving to yourself that your inner knowing is worthy of being followed. Now here's something crucial, learning to distinguish between intuition and fear, because they can feel similar at first. Both create physical sensations. Both can be strong and insistent. But here's the difference. Fear is usually accompanied by a story. Your mind is spinning scenarios, predicting disasters, trying to control outcomes. Intuition is usually simpler. It just knows. No elaborate justification needed. Fear feels clenchy, tight, panicky. Intuition feels clear. Even if what it's telling you is uncomfortable, there's a difference between this is scary but right and this is scary and wrong. Your body knows the difference if you pay attention. Also start recognizing what I call universal signs and synchronicities. Not in some superstitious way, but simply noticing when life seems to be confirming your inner guidance. You're thinking about changing careers, and suddenly articles about that field keep appearing. You're considering ending a relationship, and 3 people independently share similar stories. These aren't magical. They're your heightened awareness, noticing what's relevant. But they are also life's way of saying, yes, you're on the right track. keep going. The spiritually awake person lives in constant conversation with reality. They ask questions internally and then pay attention to how life answers. They don't need burning bushes or angelic messengers. They just need to be awake to the subtle ways guidance comes through. Now we come to perhaps the most beautiful part of all this, the ripple effect of living from your inner knowing, because when you start making choices from that deep place of authenticity, everything changes, not just for you, but for everyone around you. First, there's your work. When you follow your intuition about what you're truly here to do, not what will make the most money or impress the most people, but what genuinely lights you up, your work becomes play, becomes creation, becomes contribution. I've seen this happen so many times. Someone walks away from a secure but soul-crushing job to follow some crazy dream. Everyone thinks they're foolish, and then they bloom. They find work that doesn't feel like work. They contribute in ways they never could when they were forcing themselves into the wrong role. And here's the thing, when you're doing what you're genuinely here to do, you're not in competition with anyone, because nobody else can do exactly what you do, exactly the way you do it. You're unique. Perspective, your unique gifts, your unique combination of qualities, these become valuable precisely because they're authentic. The awake person doesn't try to be successful, they try to be genuine, and somehow, paradoxically, that's what makes them successful, because genuine is rare, authentic is magnetic. When someone is truly themselves, unfiltered and unafraid, people are drawn to that energy. The same thing happens in relationships. When you trust your intuition about who belongs in your life and who doesn't, your relationships transform. You stop forcing connections that don't fit. You stop tolerating people who drain you. You start attracting people who resonate with your authentic frequency. This can be painful. You might lose friendships that were based on who you were pretending to be. You might disappoint family members who had expectations you can no longer meet. But what you gain is so much richer. You gain relationships based on truth, on mutual respect for each other's authentic paths, on genuine connection rather than social obligation. The awake person understands that you can't be for everyone, and that's not a problem.